So I wanted to thank you for inviting me, and I also wanted to give a big thanks beforehand to the person who's translating. They are remarkable, and I will be challenging you, and you did an amazing job with a very technical subject before me, so thanks. I wanted today to talk with you about where I think the future of business is going and major trends that I see around organizational structures. And it did start, this new idea and way of doing business did start with Zipcar, and many of you probably have no idea what this company is. So it's something that I founded back in 2000. And if you're an entrepreneur, you know you're supposed to have your elevator pitch, which is a very fast way of describing your company. So I want to give you my elevator pitch so that you'll know what Zipcar is, and tell you that one day I was at a very large conference in New York City. You can go back. I was at a very large conference in New York City that was 500 women CEOs. And there were women CEOs who were CEOs of very big Fortune 100 companies and very small startups like mine that was maybe, I think I was 9 months, the company was 9 months old. And among the CEOs was the CEO of Enterprise Rent-A-Car, which is the largest car rental company in the world. And at one point, we had to go from a conference upstairs in the very tall high-rise in New York down to where we were having lunch. And I got into the elevator. Actually, I want to say I was following the CEO of Enterprise. She got into the elevator, and I got into the elevator. The door shut, and she said, "Robin," with my name tag. "So tell me, what do you do?" And I thought, I'm in an elevator, and I can give my elevator pitch. So here is the elevator pitch for Zipcar. Zipcar parks cars throughout dense metropolitan areas for people to use by the hour and by the day instead of owning their own cars. They make a reservation online or with their phone. That reservation gets sent to the car. You walk to the car because they are parked everywhere. You hold a proximity card over the windshield that unlocks the door, enables the ignition, and opens a billing record. Then you drive wherever you want, round trip, and you come back and park in that reserved parking space. When the fuel gets to 1/4 tank, if you are driving the car when it's at 1/4 tank or below, then you use our fuel card to fill it back up to full. So now you know what Zipcar is. So when we started in 2000, to take you back to this time, only 3% of the people had internet access at their homes, and 50% had access at their work, and only 50% of the people had cell phones. So it was very early on, and in an earlier session, we talked about riding trends, and so we rode a trend. Today, Zipcar went public 3 years ago, or went public 2 years ago, and Avis Rent-A-Car bought it last year. And today there are 1 million people using about 12,000 Zipcars parked across North America in the major cities, 300 university towns, and in the UK. So that's where we were, and that's where we went. The reason that I knew that Zipcar was going to succeed and why I felt very confident and why it is illustrative of this new organizational paradigm is now, change the slide, 3 reasons. One, I knew that we were leveraging excess capacity. If you think about how you drive, you can change the slide, how you drive your own car, your car is the second most expensive thing that you own. Your car is the second most expensive thing that you own, and you spend about $9,000 a year on this car, on average. Yet you only drive it 5% of the time. 95% of the time, you never drive it. And if you live in a city and you don't use a car to get to work, it means that 5 days will go by when you're going to work, and it's $125 gone. So for people who live in cities, this was a really inefficient way with a lot of excess capacity. Your alternative was to rent a car, as you know, in 24-hour bundles. But when you use a car, you might want it for 2 hours, and you might want it for 26 hours. But you were forced to buy it in these big ways. So I knew that Zipcar had an economic advantage because everyone was buying in a manner that gave them a lot of excess, and the economics were now working in my favor. Next slide. The second thing that I knew is that we had to build a platform for participation. If you think about how you do a rental company, it takes you 15 to 20 minutes to make that reservation. And if you're going to rent a car for an hour, there is no way you would do that type of transaction. It takes too long. And as a company, me, Zipcar, I would not be willing to rent you a car for an hour if it was going to require 15 minutes of my staff time to do it. The average cost of a transaction in the car rental industry is between $7 and $12 just to manage the transaction. So clearly, I had to do something in a totally new way, putting humans directly with the cars, me out of it. And I needed to make the marginal cost of each transaction very close to zero. So we needed this platform for participation. The next slide. The last thing we did is that I treated our users, I called them members, and we saw them as collaborators. If we go back to car rental, there is a counter, and the company is on this side, and you, consumers, on the other side. And what do we know? The company thinks the consumers, the buyers, are going to screw them and be terrible. And the customers know that the car rental company is doing everything they can to scrape out every piece of money, and there's no trust. We both hate each other. With Zipcar, we said there are no counters. You are with us, you are on our side, and we're going to trust you to do all sorts of things that we as a company used to do. So we're going to ask you to walk around the car by yourself and tell us if there's a problem. We're going to ask you to fill it up with our fuel card. We want you to tell us where we should park cars. What should we call the cars? What kinds of cars should we buy? We saw our members as our collaborators. And this was back in 2000. And by doing this, we could do things much more cheaply. It was much more efficient to not have to have all these employees of mine around, that it was just between us and the consumers. So this new way of doing things, and I think of us today as, and I did think of us as collaborators. Next slide. This is a cartoon I found that expressed it. This is a recent cartoon. So Moses is coming down out of the mountain with God's word, and we, in the audience, we say, is there a section at the bottom for comments? Today, in 2014, we know we are collaborators. We know we are co-creators, and we are no longer just sitting quietly back for everyone to tell us something. So that is how we've changed in the last 15 years. Next slide. I call this new organizational paradigm, this new way of doing business, Peers Incorporated. It combines people and platforms and takes excess capacity and turns it into abundance. And next slide. So there are these three components. Next slide. And, all these companies that over the last 15 years, everyone talks about it with incredible, they're saying, oh my God, how did that happen? These companies are so remarkable. All of these are Peers Incorporated companies. All of these have relied on us as individuals, as autonomous people, to be co-creators. Next. So the excess capacity, if we look at Facebook, it's my friends, my photos, my gossip. If we think of eBay, my stuff, all the open source stuff is my code. We can come down to YouTube, it's my videos. With Skype, it's really kind of fascinating. Imagine that someone built a telecommunications company. Think how expensive it is to build a telecommunications company, but they built it with my laptop, my video camera, my data connection. All of it was built on the back of me participating in my localness. And of course, Wikipedia, my friend Clay Shirky has said it nicely, that this is cognitive surplus. All of us had too much great expertise in our brains, and that's why Wikipedia worked, because we wanted to put it out. So this new organizational paradigm is really changing how we can innovate, how we're going to work, and how we build businesses. And this is what I want to talk to you about today. Next slide. So I'm very well known for sharing. And next slide, I want you to think about bed sharing. So get into your mind, bed sharing. Were you all there? Next slide. I travel around the world a lot, and when I go to new cities, I really like to stay at friends' houses and stay in their excess capacity spare bedroom. It might be their home office. Next slide. It might be a double bed. I'm very, very lucky. Next. It might be the teenager's room. You know, they've kicked the teenager out, and now I have to sleep in those very dirty sheets in that icky room. Next slide. This is why we have hotels, so that Hotels are effectively bed sharing. So I wanted to do some research, and I went to see what is the largest bed-sharing company in the world. Next slide. It's the Intercontinental Hotels Group. They've been around for 65 years, and in those 65 years, they now have 645,000 beds to rent in 100 countries. The second largest company is Hilton Hotels, and they have been around for 93 years. So think about the level of effort it took to make this. Hopefully, most of you in this audience will know, next slide, what really has happened is Airbnb, which is where you rent out your excess capacity, your spare bedroom, your apartment, in 4 years had the same amount of rooms available for rent. And this is where I do my, can you believe this? This is remarkable, transforming, disruptive. This is changing the face of industry, the face of work, the face of everything. That in 4 years, they can build what took 65 years to build otherwise. And this is happening in every single sector, everywhere. Next slide. There's also couch surfing, which is where people can stay at your house for free. And in their 9th year, they had 2.5 million rooms available for people to stay at. Next slide. So what is going on? What is going on is that we are moving from an old industrial way of doing things to a new way of doing things. Why did we ever create companies, and why did we ever create governments? It's because they could do things that we as individuals couldn't do. So, what are companies good at that I, Robin Chase, can't do? Companies are good at doing things that cost millions of dollars over many years. I, Robin Chase, don't have many millions of dollars. I can't do that. If it requires something that takes many, many kinds of intelligence to aggregate and to integrate it and simplify it, I only know 2 or 3 things. If we have to do 40 things to put them together, I can't do that by myself. Companies are very good at doing things that require consistency and standards. I, Robin Chase, can't make you do something the exact same way because you don't care what I think. You know, I can't create a standard because who am I to make a standard? We need to have big entities to create these consistent standards and these norms. And typically, this is all built together in a brand promise that you understand that you'll get all this with the brand, and these companies are typically global. But, next slide. Of course, individuals do things best themselves. We do things that are annoying, expensive, painful for big companies to do. They used to do them, but the internet has completely changed that. So what do I do as an individual that is annoying and expensive? I do things that are very, very local. I do things that are lots of small pieces. If you want something customized or specialized, we know big companies hate doing customized and specialized things. They want to make the exact same thing every time. And if you want to do something very, very particular and very fine-grained, it's going to be an individual that does it best. We've talked today about social networks. I, of course, am happy to tell all of my friends and networks things because they're my friends and networks. I do it naturally. And big companies and governments are always trying to get into that. But for me, that is normal. And, of course, local. So, next slide. When you put these things together, we see that they are incredibly complementary. And it's because, so I just had hinted briefly, it's because of the internet that finding very specific local things and dealing with lots of small parts is no longer the huge cost it used to be. So before, if a company wanted to be really good, it had to take everything inside itself and hire everyone. Everyone had to work for me. Today, that's not the case, and that's how we're not seeing things happen. Next slide. I threw this in here. This is from the OECD, and it is the broadband penetration per 100 population. So this is Korea down to Mexico. Next slide. This is where the US rates on this, so it's about 65. This is 2012 data. 65 out of 100 people in America have internet access, have broadband access. Next slide. This is Chile. Am I in the way? So this is a very impolite thing for a guest to your country to bring up. But I felt, and I'm actually making this argument in my country as well, I think those of us in this audience will agree that access to wireless and access to the internet is as important to being a citizen and as important to education, as important to being productive as water. This is no longer something that is, it's a utility. We need water, we need electricity, and we need access to the internet wirelessly. So as I say, you guys have lots of work to do, and the US has work to do. We all have work to do. But the future of innovation and entrepreneurship and business lies in this piece, because it is the way that we're changing the paradigm. Next slide. So if I look at this, next slide, this is what I'm calling Peers Incorporated. This new combination that is happening next. The incorporated side does a platform for participation, which means, and the peers side delivers a diversity of offering. Next. So that was a complicated chart, but I can boil it down, and you see that they're complementary and very symbiotic, and each side has to play well with the other. If the peers try to take too much, the incorporated, the government or the institution will say, I don't want to deal with you because you're not leaving enough value for me. Similarly, if the incorporated side takes too much, the peer is going to say, forget it. I don't want to collaborate. I'm not interested because you're not leaving enough on the table for me. Each side has to work with the other, and they're really very closely intertwined. Next slide. And it's all swimming in this sea of excess capacity. When you have excess capacity, when you're dealing with excess capacity, you become, by definition, very resource and cost effective, because you are extracting more value out of something that already exists. Next slide. So how am I defining excess capacity? Something that exists, that's been paid for, and that there's more value possible to get out of that. Next slide. There's 3 things that you can do. So as entrepreneurs in this room, as government policymakers in this room, as standard big old-fashioned companies in this room, you should be looking and finding the excess capacity, and it is such a broad definition. LinkedIn is excess capacity. Me and my networks, that's excess capacity. It could be hours, a certain time of the day. It can be, as I'm saying, it can be virtual assets, it can be physical assets, it can be processes and operations that you can get more out of. So 3 ways to treat the excess capacity once you find it. 1 is to slice it. So if you think of Zipcar, we used to only be able to buy cars in one way. That was a much bigger bite than people wanted to consume it. So Zipcar gave people just the slice that they wanted. So we got much, much more value. Zipcars are used about 60% of the day compared to you using your own 5% of the day. The second thing you can do is aggregate it. If you think of Airbnb, it is not like 350,000 beds and breakfasts. It's much, much more powerful than that. So they took all these little tiny pieces of things and they brought it into one asset that is easy to compare, to buy, to comment. And the third, and I think this is the most important one, is to take an asset and open it up and say, here I had this data I collected. What new ideas do you have on it? And this is where we create amazing abundance. So this is something that you're saying, I don't know how you're going to use it, but please feel free to have a try. And because it's already been paid for and it already exists, when you as an entrepreneur use that type of asset, you're getting something for very, very, very cheap. There was mentioned here today, and I was just thinking I want to use it as an example. Sophie, let me just, for Zipcar, to go to this idea, that Zipcar, when Zipcar made an agreement with MIT and with Harvard for parking spaces, that was good. I wanted to have some parking spaces at MIT and Harvard. But much more important to me is I wanted MIT to send out an email to its 35,000 staff, faculty, and students to say, hey, join Zipcar, and there's a car here. That, for me, as Zipcar, would have cost me a lot of money. For MIT, it was excess capacity. They had the email all set up, everything was done, they just do it like this, it costs them nothing. So that's what, as entrepreneurs, we need to get to more of. Next slide. Next slide. So let me talk about the incorporated side and then building a platform for participation. If you build a platform, and it is really, really hard to get right, and we had an earlier conversation today about Chile is really far away, how do we do global things? By building platforms for participation where you are the organizing force, and everywhere around the world they can come onto that in a virtual way. When you get that platform right, everybody gets economies of scale, because with Zipcar, if I had 10,000 members using the platform I had made, or 1 million using the marginal cost of adding each one was nothing. So it's the same thing with Facebook, it's the same thing with YouTube. And once you get it right, because you are a platform, those economies of scale definitely happen, and you have the ability to grow very quickly. So I want to show you some slides of very high growth. Next slide. So there's a company called Topcoder, which is a very large design and engineering firm. You can see their growth curve here. And they have 600,000 engineers who are freelance, who are participating on Topcoder. Next slide. This is BlaBlaCar, the largest ride-sharing company in the world. Ride-sharing means I want to go from one major city to another major city, and I'm driving in my car alone, and there are 3 extra seats, completely excess capacity. They have been growing, and you can see that they now have 6 million members. As of the end of this year, it's now actually already 7 million. Next slide. And just looking at their growth curve, they moved in 2013, 10 million people. Next. It's 1 million passengers a month they're moving today, which is the same as is moved by 2,500 high-speed trains or 2,500 747s. Yet they did not have to lay a train track, they didn't have to buy a train car. And they were able to move this volume of people in that period of time. Next. Here's a company called Etsy, which is a marketplace for things that people make by themselves. They've been growing, and last year, which was maybe their 8th year, they still grew at 50% because they have the platform and people are bringing their own assets, their own stuff on top of it. Next slide. This is an example, it's very funny. This is called Fiverr.com, and it's what would you do for $5? And if you want to buy a crazy birthday present for $5, you should go look. I met them when they were just 3 weeks old, and they had 65,000 gigs, they call them, of things to do for $5. Today, they're over 3 million. Next slide. Here's another new one, because I'm trying to tell you that this is happening in every single sector. Duolingo is it's 20 months old now. It's a company that offers free language lessons in many, many languages. And then the excess capacity is that on the back of people learning how to speak a language for free, they are translating CNN and BuzzFeed into Spanish and French and getting paid by BuzzFeed and CNN to do it. So you can see their growth curve. Next slide. So coming back to this, next slide, I want to talk about the peers, and if you have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people participating, what you get is diversity. That is what you absolutely get is diversity. And when you have diversity, you have a lot of innovation because each one of us has different ideas of ways of doing things, and we're all iterating on this same platform, and we have a lot of resilience and redundancy. Next slide. The most incredible example of this, of what I consider to be a peers and corporate organizational structure, is if you think of the smartphone, you bought it for $600, and you bought it for 1 or 2 very specific use cases. And for me, it's not the telephone. I bought it so I could look at my email online. But then, it's not quite open. It's mostly open. In the 4.5 years that smartphones have existed, we now have over 2 million apps, which is the peers on top of this platform. I think, and I'm making this up, but I believe that 2 million new ideas in 5 years is probably the highest rate of innovation ever known in humanity, ever. 2 million new ideas in 5 years. And if we think about what Marcus was saying earlier, there is no way that Apple, Steve Jobs did not want to do this. He was forced to do it. But there's no way that Steve Jobs could have come up with 1 million ideas. And lots of those ideas are dumb. They are dumb because they don't have to, they're not worth $600, and so it doesn't matter. I can do an app on it because I don't have to pull the whole economic value of $600. And some are ingenious. And some are so genius that people are buying smartphones for reasons that have nothing to do with me talking on the telephone or me getting, email. So it's required the innovation of millions, tens of thousands of minds to come up with these innovations. Next slide. The company that I founded in France 3 years ago is called Buzzcar. It's renting out your own car to your friends and neighbors. So it's excess capacity because your own car is sitting idle most of the time. And I just want to show you, just click through these next slides. These are pictures of the owners and their cars, and you can see that there's very many different types of people and different types of cars, cool people, not cool people, hipsters, of course, you know, proud and lovely. And each one of these cars is in a different location, go back one, is in a different location at a different price point and a different type of car. And to the diversity, the possibility of what a Peers Incorporated company can offer is that one of our users rented a car to drive to an island off the coast of France. And when she went to pick up the keys, that owner said, "Oh my gosh, you're going to Ile de Ré. I love Ile de Ré. This is the side that has beautiful cliff road. If you come on this side, there's these beautiful beaches. This is my favorite beach, and here is my favorite fish restaurant." That is what a Peers Incorporated company can give you. Very specific localization, customization, specialization. And if we think of where do individuals, are they going to fit in the world, we're going to be autonomous, and we're going to do these things. I'm writing a book on this topic now, and the reason I feel like this is the organizational structure for our times, because we know things are rapidly evolving at an amazing pace. We need to innovate at a pace we never imagined before. We have a lot of unemployment issues, and this is the way that, and companies will be doing this more and more because, as I say, it's very, very cost effective. It's a very fast way to get innovation out. I'm not having to pay for lots of things. People are opting in and putting their own assets on. And if I think about what is creating the largest rate of change and why I'm also here is next slide, is I'm very concerned with, next slide, climate change. And so this is a report that was put out by the World Bank about 1.5 years ago. The World Bank is a very conservative financial institution. And so this report is saying that by 2100, we will have average global warming of plus 4 degrees centigrade. If you're like me, do you guys work in centigrade or Fahrenheit in Chile? So if you're like me, you have no idea what is plus 4 degrees meaning. I don't know what does that mean to me to have plus 4 degrees global average climate change. So I went and did my research. Next slide. Next slide. What I found out is that the last time we were minus 4 degrees centigrade was during the last ice age. And North America and Europe were under several kilometers of ice. So the difference between minus 4 degrees and today is, next slide, is 35,000 years and a kilometer or more of ice. But we are going forward 4 degrees in 85 years. Just imagine. Humans have never existed in plus 4 degrees. Next slide. It gets worse. When I was doing this research, when we talk about global average climate change, of course, it's cooler over oceans and warmer over land. So we will be seeing plus 6 degrees over land in the next, by 2100, and by 2060, if every country doesn't do what it's promised to do. So I know that we always are talking about climate change being something for, do it for your grandchildren. If by 2060 it is going to be plus 6 degrees over land, by 2030 it's going to be very ugly. And that is no time away. By 2040 it's going to be worse. So for me and for you, there's really no thing that we should be doing more than addressing this topic. Next slide. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that issues reports every few years just had a report that came out about 4 weeks ago. One of the authors in the press said it very clearly. The difference between plus 2 degrees climate change, which is where governments are agreeing that they want to go no farther, but we are going farther, and plus 4 degrees is the difference between driving on an icy road at 50 kilometers an hour versus 145. It's risky at the 30, which is what we're headed towards now, but it is deadly at 90. We're very, very polite when we're writing these reports and reading these reports. What does it mean to go to plus 4 degrees global average climate change? We don't want to say that reality, but it's quite clear here. The reality is they're not going to be any humans. So we are living in a place no humans ever lived at this amount. It's completely changing all the ecosystems, every place we grow food, the oceans. We have to move at great pace. Next slide. Next slide. So my friend Manny Banerjee, he said, you can't solve exponential problems with linear solutions. And that is a really wonderful sentence. It's very clear and straight. Next slide. And this is why I've been saying try Peers Incorporated. Next slide. I want to tell you these 3 things that the Peers Incorporated business model can deliver us that is giving me my optimism. So when you have a Peers Incorporated business model, it is changing the laws of physics. If in the year 2000, I had said to you, you know what? I want to make the biggest hotel chain in the world, and I'm going to do it, and I'm going to beat those intercontinental hotel guys in 4 years. Every single one of us in this room would have said, that is physically impossible. We would have said, there's no way that you can buy the land, get the architect, build the things, then go hire the staff, then put all the furniture in, then the staff, then get the guests, make them all be successful in 4 years. We would have, every single one of us said, impossible. Next slide. So here's the growth curve of building hotels under business as usual. So business as usual asset building. And here are the first 4 years. Next slide. Here is Airbnb's growth curve using the Peers Incorporated model and very specifically leveraging excess capacity, stuff that already existed locally and was already paid for. By leveraging excess capacity, we can grow at a totally different pace than normal. Next slide. And Airbnb didn't just get the people who are signing their rooms in, they have the guests that are filling the rooms that match those numbers. Next slide. The second thing that the Peers Incorporated business model can do is it can change the pace of learning beyond what we thought was humanly possible. We know as individuals that we can learn at a certain pace, but we kind of believe that companies can kind of grow faster. Next slide. So if we go back to Duolingo, the translation, the learning to learn a language company, the standard that we measure language learning is 1 semester of university. So 1 semester of learning at college, just picture I'm a professor, I'm starting to teach French, I have 1 semester and I teach my 30 students and then I say, after that semester, I'm going to do this better. And so then you have another semester and another 30 students. And in my entire professional career, I might get to improve myself and understand students 60 times, 70 times in my entire career. The standard in language learning is the Rosetta Stone. And the Rosetta Stone has been around for about 20 years, and you see it in airports. It's very expensive ways to learn language. They have been around for 20 years, and they are very proud of themselves. They say, we can teach you a semester of college language French in 54 hours. And we all say, wow, that's an amazing improvement. Go. So Duolingo, I was talking with the founder CEO. Duolingo, he told me, he said, I can conduct 100 experiments simultaneously with 100,000 people doing each one of those experiments, and in 48 hours, I can tell you what is the best way to teach that language. Next slide. And so he, after 20 months, has gotten it down to 34 hours, giving you the same amount of language acquisition that takes 120 hours in class and 54 the Rosetta Stone. Clearly, we can't learn forever, but with the Peers Incorporated business model, there's 2 ways that we're learning. One is the platform is seeing how the process itself, the actual platform is used by millions of people, so it can improve very, very quickly. And the second thing it can do is it can find best practice. It alone can see that best practice, and it can push it back out to everybody else, so everyone can have best practice. And so that's how we can now learn at a place that was inconceivable before. Next slide. This I wanted to show, and I've got to get out of the way here, and I hope you guys can see it. You're missing the good part. If you think about being an entrepreneur going up against a company that's been around forever, this is Google Trends, and you type in Rosetta Stone, Duolingo, and it tells you how many people searched on that term. So in 2005, Rosetta Stone, which is still getting counts for history, students during history, here's where they were. And here, some of you can't see, Rosetta Stone got invented, and they have crossed already in 20 months Rosetta Stone and taken them down. Next slide. The third reason that Peers Incorporated can do remarkable things is if we think about, we all talk about supercomputers, and we say, wow, supercomputers can do so many calculations simultaneously that it's remarkable. But we also talk about how the human brain and its ability to do pattern recognition has never been matched by any computers, that the human brain is the most remarkable. With the Peers Incorporated organizational structure, we are combining the power of all that computing power and all the amazing power of individuals who are fabulous at pattern recognition, and we can bring these things together. So it's another way that we can go at a different pace. Next slide. So I'm going to leave you with the 3 things that I wish you would be doing. One is go find some excess capacity and exploit it. It is absolutely your cheapest, best resource. Build community muscle, that when we're building these Peers Incorporated platforms, many times, and in many cases, you can make a community around that, a community of users. And when you have a community of users, you get all the power of viralness, of higher switching costs, of sharing learning. And if we think about the future that is coming towards us very, very fast, which I believe is going to get very ugly and unpleasant, when we think about any disaster, and I would say Valparaiso is one, and in the US, Katrina and Sandy, when the bad thing happens, there are no experts and no governments and whatever. The people that are around you, your community, is the one that reacts the fastest. So all of us need to start exercising our community muscle, so when bad things happen, we have community muscle memory and a community muscle reflex. When bad things happen, we know what to do. And the last is, as I fly around the world and as I talk to governments and cities and companies, if you want to do big things, you must focus on creating platforms for participation. Don't get in the game unless you're going to build platforms, because that's what can scale really fast. That's what can address our problems really fast. So if you're trying to do good work, build a platform, because that's how it can scale. And then I'll just leave you with a last slide. Next slide. So there's a young man in the US who was arrested for arrested around climate change because he won at a land auction that he couldn't pay the money for. He was just trying to disrupt things. In any case, Tim DeChristopher said, "We are on track for such rapid and intense change, we might as well steer towards the world we want to see." And so that is what I'm doing with my life, and we all should be doing. We've talked about social entrepreneurship and the future of business and assets. Every day, I'm trying to build the world that I want to live in, because it's happening very fast in real time. And so I'm encouraging you all with your own very specific local expertise that you uniquely are qualified to put your resources together with your communities and create the world you want to live in. Thank you.